And thanks once again for joining us for this Thursday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm David Percy, and up first, high wind warning in the western Aleutians that went into effect at noontime today and will stay in effect through 4 p.m. Friday, tomorrow afternoon. And so this forecast is pretty much spot on. Southwest winds expected to increase later tonight, actually turning west. The southeast now expected to turn southwest and pick up 60 to 80 miles per hour with gusts to 100 miles per hour. And the strongest winds will be Shimmy Attu area for those higher gusts. And then lighter gusts, lighter winds out toward Amchitka, but still in the high wind warning category. And of course, high winds may move loose debris and may damage property. Travel could be difficult. And from there, taking a look at the main hazards weather graph, we've got a wind advisory out until 10 p.m. this evening for the Alaska Range there, and mainly the eastern Alaska Range. And through the passes, look for winds of 40 miles an hour with gusts to 60 miles an hour. And there, the strongest winds will be north of Black Rapids. And then down over the Panhandle, northern Panhandle, Juneau Borough on up to Skagway, Haines, and those locations there in the shaded area. That's a flood watch back in effect, and that goes into effect tomorrow afternoon and stays in effect through Saturday afternoon. And for expecting additional rainfall could result in flooding, possibility of some flooding there with the rainfall coming in with a couple of systems. And from there, taking a look at satellite imagery, you can see low pressure tracking eastward there. Kind of hard to pick the center out here on the imagery, but the main frontal boundary you can see all the way up into the eastern North Slope Arctic coast area, and then down through the Yukon and right on down across the northern Panhandle there in eastern North Gulf Coast, and some more moisture there with the circulation coming up, pushing more rain into south central Alaska, Prince William Sound today, and then more showery down toward Kodiak Island and Bristol Bay, with some areas of precipitation over the western interior as well. But that's pretty light. Anything over the northern interior is pretty darn light, only a few hundredths of an inch reported to maybe just 1/100th of an inch along the Arctic coast there, which fell in the form of snow, but really didn't amount to too much. And then out to the west there, you can see intense storm tracking up towards Shimmy. Actually expects low center should pass just to the west of Shimmy and Attu. And that's a classic high wind pattern there for them, with it passing to the west as it tracks northward, and actually very tight gradient west-southwest winds expected to be hurricane force for the marine areas there. Otherwise, kind of a break in advance of that over the eastern Aleutians and Pribilofs. And looking at the chart today, you can see out west there that pretty strong, very strong, intense 947 millibar low with a very tight pressure field associated with it. That bringing storm force winds currently into the western Aleutians there, with a fair amount of precipitation to go along with that. Otherwise, weakening front spread a fair amount of rain into the North Gulf Coast today and was bringing some rain into the northern Panhandle. As that passed through, let's see, Homer and Valdez both picked up about 0.8 of an inch of rain today. Of course, with Homer, it's due to that trough down to the south there across the Barren Islands, and Valdez just that south to north flow carrying the moisture in. Yakutat picked up 1 1/3 inches in the 12-hour period ending at 3 p.m. this afternoon, and some lighter amounts over the northern Panhandle. Out to the west, Golovin there picked up about 1/4 of an inch of rain, as did Anchorage. Otherwise, most areas had less than that. Some areas of rain in the Kuskokwim Valley down into Bristol Bay. Snow flurries along the Arctic coast, locally into the North Slope there. But a lot of clearing north of the Alaska, actually in the Copper River Basin, due to southerly winds coming off the coast range there. Gulf Canada had south winds gusting to 30 miles an hour. And then those winds blowing across the Alaska Range really cleared it out over the mid and upper Tanana Valley today on up into the Yukon Flats, with temperatures pushing 60 degrees in some areas like Eagle and upper 50s in the Fairbanks area, with Delta Junction having a peak wind gust so far of 45 miles per hour. Otherwise, pretty tight gradient there along the southwest coast, with winds gusting 30 to 40 miles an hour in the exposed areas there along the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coast, Nunivak Island, and gusts of wind to 52 miles an hour out of the west-northwest occurred at Cold Bay, and about 40 miles an hour at False Pass there. Lighter winds over the eastern Aleutians, high pressure ridge moving in. Winds can come down, skies trying to clear out there. And for the forecast for tonight, that intense storm moves north of the Shimiat 2 area. And again, look for winds gusting to 100 miles per hour throughout the night tonight. Once that low center passes to the north or gets north of the area, get a little extra forcing there. And pretty gale force winds into the central Aleutians, along and ahead of that front, with rain spreading into the eastern Aleutians late tonight, as well as the Pribilofs. Otherwise, a couple of weak lows there along the southwest coast near the Aleutian Range, southwest of Kodiak Island. Keep showers going with light winds across that area. Rain and showers of rain or snow, with snow, of course, at the higher elevations along the North Gulf Coast, south central Alaska. And some of that may get into the Copper River Basin, but mostly along the Alaska Range. Pretty light even there. It stays dry over the mid and upper Tanana Valley into the Yukon Flats. Then kind of a weak trough brings some light snow along the Arctic coast, North Slope, through the Brooks Range, and on down into the Koyukuk Valley. But mounts will be pretty light there, with maybe some rain and snow showers down to the mid and lower Yukon River Valley areas. And the warm front starts to increase the rain again over the southern panhandle. The remnants of the first front and trough, they're still keeping it wet from Yakutat into Juneau and Haines area, Skagway, Elfin Cove, Gustavus, those areas. And for the Friday forecast, that low starting to take a track to the east now, not really going to push any farther to the north. So that leaves St. Lawrence Island pretty nice tomorrow, with winds not too bad out of the east, maybe 10 to 20 miles per hour, with maybe some clearing, dry conditions. But wind and rain into the Pribilof Islands and Fox Islands, with an increase in the wind and precipitation coming into the Alaska Peninsula. But that front starting to weaken in that portion there. You can see the gradient not that tight at all associated with the front, but still pretty tight along the western and central Aleutians, southern Bering Sea. Hurricane force wind warnings out for a portion of the day tomorrow for the western Aleutians, with storm warnings for Amchitka Island, gale warnings out for the Adak-Atka area. And look for snow showers along the eastern Arctic coast, with areas of light snow or flurries over the eastern North Slope into the central Brooks Range there, tapering off south of the mountains. Otherwise, pretty dry over the southwest interior. Actually, all the western interior looking pretty dry tomorrow. And rain, possibly moderate to heavy at times with that warm front, with the flood watch for the northern panhandle areas, lighter amounts down to the south. And for the day on Saturday, that low center continues to weaken as it tracks eastward toward the Pribilof Islands. It'll probably pass over St. Paul and St. George as it takes more of a southeasterly track. And that'll be overnight Saturday night, and it'll continue to weaken as it tracks in toward western Bristol Bay. So strongest winds will be over by Saturday evening with that feature, but still looking at some gales over the eastern Aleutian areas. And look for rain with gusty winds for the Pribilofs tomorrow, and winds beginning to lighten up during the afternoon or throughout the entire day for the western and central Aleutians there. And that front just breaks apart as it hits the southwest coast, actually shears apart when it crosses Kodiak Island there, with just some showers possible, showers for the Bristol Bay area, dry for the Yukon Delta, maybe some clearing for the Seward Peninsula and Noatak Valley. Areas of light snow again, eastern Arctic coast and North Slope into the Brooks Range, scattered rain and snow showers over the remainder of the central and southeast interior. And maybe a dry day for northern Cook Inlet, Anchorage, Palmer, maybe some clearing as well, hopefully. And that front dragging across the southern panhandle, look for some light rain with that. Drying out to the north, just some isolated showers by Saturday afternoon with, I believe, VFR flying conditions. And for the lows tonight, in the upper 40s, lower 50s for the panhandle, otherwise upper 30s to lower 40s elsewhere around the state, down to near freezing for king salmon. Highs tomorrow, lower 50s, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, south central Alaska. Lower 50s, Copper River Basin, Kuskokwim Valley near 50. In the 50s for the Panhandle. Lows on Saturday morning in the 30s over the interior areas, including the Kenai Peninsula. Actually, most areas. Lower 40s, Kodiak Island. Upper 40s to mid 50s for the Panhandle, followed by highs 55 to 60 for the southeast coast. Upper 40s, Copper River Basin. Lower 50s, south central Alaska. Mid 50s for Kodiak Island. Up to the north, lows in the 20s and 30s tonight, followed by highs in the 40s to lower 50s south of the Brooks Range, in the 30s north of the mountains. Lows 20s, Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast, even down into the Kobuk Valley there. Noatak Valley lows in the 20s, otherwise 30s, followed by highs in the upper 30s for the northern interior valleys, 20s to upper 30s for the Brooks Range, lower 30s for the Arctic coast. Look for 30s and 40s for the lows tonight out over the Aleutians and Bering Sea area, 35 for St. Lawrence Island, highs 50s for the Aleutians, otherwise 40s, followed by lows in the 40s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Okay, flying weather, a lot of VFR up over the northern interior, on out to the Arctic coast, all of the Brooks Range, on down into Selawik Valley there, Buckland, and marginal VFR along the lower and mid Yukon River, but IFR across southern Alaska along the southwest coast. Most of the Panhandle and a big area of IFR that with the major storm over the southwest Bering Sea and along the front pushing just east of Atka, and conditions falling over the Fox Islands. And we'll see for the afternoon that area pushes to the Alaska Peninsula and covers the Pribilofs. Another area up around St. Lawrence Island and across the Yukon Delta, Norton Sound, extending northeast up the Yukon River there into the Kobuk Valley. IFR central eastern Arctic coast, eastern North Slope down into the eastern Brooks Range, but VFR north of the Alaska Range, mid and upper Tanana Valley, 40-mile country on up to the Yukon Flats, looking pretty good for the afternoon. Kodiak Island becoming VFR. Marginal VFR across much of southern Alaska with some IFR over Togiak Bay and the eastern North Gulf Coast. The Panhandle, all IFR. And that's about the same Saturday morning, a little bit of improvement along the north coast there of the Panhandle. Southern Copper River Basin, actually most of the Copper River Basin IFR that extends westward there from northern Cook Inlet, actually Turnagain Knik Arms up across Madanuska-Susitna Valley to the Alaska Range. Kuskokwim Valley down into Bristol Bay, and most of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, all IFR. Alaska Peninsula becoming marginal for the western Alaska Peninsula. And then from Unmak Island out to about Kiska, pretty good VFR for the morning Saturday. And for the afternoon, IFR, eastern Arctic coast, southward to the Brooks Range and actually into the almost to the Yukon River there. Otherwise, another band of IFR across southwest Alaska, actually the southern Kuskokwim Valley, western Alaska Range, southern Cook Inlet to the southern Kenai Peninsula. Marginal VFR almost everywhere else, eastward to Yakutat, but Panhandle, VFR for the afternoon Saturday. A lot of IFR out over the Bering Sea, but from Adak westward to Shimi and Attu, VFR. And for the Anatuvik Pass, IFR early, becoming marginal VFR. Also a slow improvement for Adigan as well, so IFR to start, maybe marginal in the afternoon toward evening. Lake Clark and Merrill, mostly marginal for the day tomorrow. Same forecast for rainy. And for the Windy Pass, occasionally marginal. Lowest conditions probably on the southern entrance. And for Isabel, marginal VFR with VFR out the north side. And for Mentasta, VFR, marginal VFR south entrance. And Tanita, marginal VFR most of the day. A lot of these passes pretty marginal for the day Friday. And Portage, IFR early on, then becoming marginal. And for Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 feet or less. They're up over the northwest part of the state, western Brooks Range on out to the Arctic coast, and then about 4,000 to 6,000 feet over the southeast interior and the Panhandle, about 6,000 to 9,000 feet there. Out over the Bering Sea, mainly the Aleutians running about 6,000 to 10,000 feet. And for icing, looks like some considerable moderate rime icing above about 7,000 feet there, sliding up into the northern Panhandle and then possible isolated moderate up along the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and then a more extensive area of isolated moderate pushing across with a frontal boundary and that big storm across the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, and Pribilofs pushing up to St. Matthew Island. Looking at the jet stream, upper level low south of the Kenai Peninsula tomorrow, so we've got northwest flow across the western coastal areas in the interior there at about 65 to 75 knots, and 90 knot southwest winds into the northern Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, eastern Copper River Basin areas, westerlies, south side of that big storm, 95 to 120 knots over the Aleutians. And at 9,000 feet, 75 knot winds now north of the Aleutians across the southwest Bering Sea. Pretty light over the eastern Bering Sea and western interior. 35 to 45 knots south-southwesterlies over the eastern part of the state, and up to 55 knots out of the south over the northern Panhandle. 55 knot winds off the north coast of the Panhandle at 3,000 feet, and the stronger westerlies there out over the Bering Sea up to 75 knots. And for turbulence, considerable moderate chop for the Pribilofs, all of the Aleutians, western Alaska Peninsula, and along the Panhandle and the eastern Arctic coast.
Hi there, Super Jupers. This week, Jupiter reached opposition. This means it's opposite the sun relative to us, and it's also close to us at only 400 million miles away. This makes it great for viewing in a small telescope. Let me show you how to find it. Hit the darkness anytime after 9 p.m. this week, and if you look toward the east, you'll see a very bright, non-twinkling light. That is Jupiter. If you've got a good set of binoculars, point them at that gas giant. But even better is a small telescope. This is one of the best views of the planet that you're gonna get. Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system. It has over 70 moons, some of which we have plans to explore. And even with its huge size, it rotates once every 10 Earth hours. The gaseous atmosphere is fast moving and contains storms which are larger than our whole planet. The sky, it's incredible. Keep looking up.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and we have a special guest in the studio today. We welcome Amanda Terborg of the Aviation Weather Center. Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Amanda's flown in all the way from Kansas City, and for those of you that don't know, the Aviation Weather Center serves the lower 48 for aviators, just as the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit here in Anchorage serves all of Alaska. So I kind of wonder, what's the Aviation Weather Center in Kansas City doing to help out Alaska, Amanda?
Yeah, you know, we do a lot of collaboration work with our sister station up here. Lately, we've been doing a lot of work, especially in the satellite meteorology.
Okay.
In particular, we have been looking at ways to better identify icing conditions in clouds, which is a big deal up here because, as I'm coming to find out, even though I'm not from here, you guys have a lot of pilots here.
We have a lot of pilots. In
Yeah.
fact, it's, when you say you can't get there from here, that's how you get there.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so with icing potential then, what's Kansas City working on?
Well, we are working on something that will help us, again, identify the icing in the clouds. You don't want ice on your aircraft.
No.
Not only does it add a whole bunch of extra weight to your airframe when it attaches to the wings and the nose cone, but it can also mess with your aerodynamics.
Right.
And in the most serious conditions, that can mess with it enough that you can actually crash.
It changes the shape of the wing, and that makes it sometimes impossible to fly, right?
It does, yeah. So we want to figure out a way to better forecast for that.
Makes sense.
Now this particular image is over Alaska. The colors here are a little goofy. It doesn't look like your run-of-the-mill satellite image.
Okay.
But the red is where you have liquid clouds and the blue is ice. But again, it really doesn't tell you a lot where you have icing conditions in that cloud. Because in those clouds there's little droplets and they're cold and they're actually below freezing, but they're still liquid. And that makes them sticky.
Okay.
So when an aircraft flies through there, those droplets are sticking to the aircraft and it can happen amazingly fast.
Right.
And so that's what we're trying to find. And there is a product called the Aircraft Flight Icing Threat that does this. And it's basically looking at the temperature of the cloud, and it's also looking at the size of the droplets to identify a probability and intensity of those icing conditions.
Okay.
And if you flip to the next image, this is a case from Juneau, Alaska, where this probably wouldn't have been the best day to fly around Juneau.
Okay.
Now there was an area of moisture that pushed south from the southwest up along the coast that pushed in a stratus layer. And in the stratus layer, there was a lot of those super cooled liquid drops, or a lot of stickiness.
Okay.
And so the flight icing threat was able to, in the pinks and the reds there, was able to identify where that icing was. Now this is really cool. You know, it's really cool to be able to identify that. There is, you know, of course, caveats to every product. Much as we wish it would happen, sun doesn't shine all the time, unless, I guess, if you live in northern Alaska during the summertime.
Right, right.
But we need that sun to be able to bounce off those clouds and to be able to see where those super cool drops are.
Okay, so it's a daytime only tool.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right now, of course, you know, we're in the era of advanced satellite technology, and there is a satellite that can actually use moonlight to see clouds.
Yes.
And so sometime in the future, we hope to be able to do that.
Okay.
Another thing that is a bit of a challenge is multiple layers of clouds. You know, you can only see so far through a thick cloud.
Okay.
And if it's thick enough, sometimes you can't see a layer of icing that's below there.
Right, right.
But even besides those caveats, this product has a lot of potential to help out Alaskan aviators here.
Well, it sounds like a really big deal, and something that forecasters at the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit could use probably on a daily basis, and especially in the middle of a really big storm.
Yeah, I would think so.
Do you have a really good success story in the lower 48 using this tool?
You know, it's a fairly new product, and so we're still evaluating it. But yeah, we have had a lot of cases where we have seen that it does tend to capture those icing conditions.
Okay, very good. Well, Amanda, thanks so much for sharing some of the very interesting satellite imagery and the tools that you're using there at the Aviation Weather Center in Kansas City with us here in Alaska. People can probably find some of this information online, right?
Yeah, here is a website here. It's a page from NASA Langley, and they have this imagery as well as a bunch of other satellite imagery that you can take a look at.
Okay, great. And I'm sure our friends at the Alaska Aviation Weather Center and the unit will be using that in the coming months there with your training and your help there to learn more about that tool to help Alaska aviators any day of the year. That's wonderful stuff. So thanks again for joining us, Amanda, and we welcome you to view any of our Alaska weather facts on YouTube anytime at the address below, and we'll see you next time. And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And for marine forecasts for the central and south coast of the Panhandle, south to southeast winds 30 knots, seas running 9 to 11 feet. Much lighter winds on the north coast, south to southeast at 10 to 15 knots. Northern Interchannel, south winds 20 knots, Stevens Passage south at 15, and small craft advisories for Clarence Strait for southeast winds at 25 knots. And for Saturday, first day of the weekend, west winds 20 knots on the south coast and west winds 20 to 25 knots for the north coast. Lincoln Glacier Bay, small craft advisories, south winds 25 knots, south winds at 20 knots for Stevens Passage, northwest winds 20 knots for Clarence Strait with seas of 4 feet. Prince William Sound, south winds 15 knots for Friday, seas 3 feet. Light variable winds for the North Gulf Coast and Barren Islands at 10 knots with seas 6 to 7 feet. Southeast winds 15 knots for Kamishak Bay, Cook Inlet, south winds 15 knots, 3-foot seas. And for Saturday for Cook Inlet, light winds from the south and southeast at about 10 knots, seas down to 2 to 3 feet. Kamishak Bay, southeast winds 15 knots. And small craft advisories for the Barren Islands, winds will be south at 25 knots, and southwest winds 25 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, southeast winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. Kodiak Island, variable winds at 10 to 15 knots, seas as high as 8 feet. And for the Alaska Peninsula, looking at west-northwest winds at 25 knots with seas just under 10 feet. Bristol Bay, south winds at 15 knots. And for Saturday, Bristol Bay, south winds 15 knots. And for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, south winds 25 knots with 16-foot seas. Otherwise, Pacific side, west-southwest winds 25 knots, seas up to 12 feet. Kodiak Island, southwest winds 25 knots. And for Unalaska Island, for Friday, south winds at 30 knots. Gale warnings for Unimak Island, southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Central Aleutians, gale warnings, southwest winds 40 to 45 knots, seas 25 to 30 feet. Storm warnings for Amchitka Island, southwest winds 55 knots. And hurricane force wind warnings from Kiska to Shemya, west winds 65 knots, seas 35 feet. And for Saturday, Winds drop down to 30 knots from Shemya to Kiska from the west, and 40-knot winds out of the west for Amchitka Island. Central Aleutians, gale warnings continue. West winds 35 to 45 knots, seas 20 to 26 feet. And gale warnings for the Fox Islands for west-southwest winds 30 to 40 knots with seas running 16 to 25 feet. For the southwest coast, south to southeast winds for Friday at 20 knots. And gale warnings for the Pribilof, southeast winds increasing to 35 knots, seas building to 10 feet. East winds for St. Matthew and St. Lawrence Island at 30 knots. Southeast winds 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coast. And for Saturday, small craft advisories for the Yukon Delta coast, east winds 25 knots, east winds 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, northeast at 20 knots with 20-foot seas, and southeast winds 25 knots with 21-foot seas for the Pribilof Islands. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast on Friday, west-northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Otherwise, for the central coast all the way over to Cape Thompson, winds will be out of the north at 15 knots. Cape Thompson to Wales, looking at a north wind Friday of 20 knots with seas around 6 feet. And then for Saturday, we've got 25-knot winds, so small craft advisories there from Cape Beaufort to Cape Thompson. Otherwise, from Cape Thompson to Wales, northeast at 20, western Arctic coast, same thing, northeast winds 20 knots. And for the central and eastern Arctic coast, look for north to northwest winds at 15 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas. For tonight, low pressure off the eastern Arctic coast. I'll circulate some colder air out over the open water there and pick some snow up. And so areas of light snow at times for the Arctic coast, north slope into the Brooks Range. And some of that could fall down into the Koyukuk Valley, becoming more of a rain and snow, light rain and snow over the mid-Yukon River Valley. Areas of rain or snow, depending on your elevation, southern Alaska. Rain starts to increase over the southern panhandle with lightning rainfall amounts in the north. Big storm, again, high wind warnings out for the western Aleutians through tomorrow, through midday tomorrow for possible gusts to 100 miles an hour around Shemya and Attu. Otherwise, that front starts to weaken as it pushes eastward there with wind and rain into the eastern Aleutians. Have a great evening.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.